The woman they threw away. They sent her off like a piece of furniture nobody wanted anymore, wrapped her few belongings in a flour sack, pointed her toward a stranger's wagon, and told her to be grateful someone was willing to take her at all. Lydia Ashcroft was 23 years old and had never once in her life been told she mattered. Her father called her plain. Her brothers called her worse. The frontier called her nothing, because nobody out here even knew her name. But the man waiting at the end of that dusty road? He was about to find out that the woman her family threw away like kitchen scraps was the most valuable thing any of them had ever held, and been too blind and too cruel to keep. If this is your first time here, welcome to our channel. Stay with us all the way through. This story will surprise you. And if these stories move you, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Lydia left the Ashcroft homestead, nobody came outside to watch her go. Not her father, not either of her brothers, not even the dog, who was tied to the fence post and straining against his rope toward the tree line, interested in something more worth his attention than a girl carrying a flour sack down a dirt path at 6:30 in the morning. She didn't cry about it. She'd learned a long time ago that crying in this family got you nothing but mocked, so she'd stopped doing it somewhere around age 12 and hadn't properly started again since. She just walked. Head down, boots raising little puffs of dust, the sack bumping against her hip with every step. The wagon was waiting at the road junction a quarter mile from the house. Earl Pickett's wagon. Earl being the nearest thing Millhaven County had to a postal courier and general carrier of gossip. He was a narrow-faced man in his 50s with a tobacco habit and no talent for silence, and he was already looking at her with that particular expression people in this valley had been giving her most of her life, like she was something mildly puzzling, like they weren't quite sure what category to put her in. "You the Ashcroft girl?" he said. "I am." "The one they're sending to Holloway's place?" "Appears so." He looked her over once, not rudely but not kindly either, just the way a man looks when he's trying to reconcile what he expected with what showed up. Then he nodded at the wagon bed. "Climb up then. Got 3 other stops before we get out to the Holloway spread." She climbed up, settled herself in the corner with her sack in her lap and her eyes forward. Earl clucked at the horses and they lurched into motion, and that was the end of Lydia Ashcroft's life in the place where she'd been born. She should explain, or rather, the story should explain, because Lydia herself would never have volunteered any of this. How she'd ended up in Earl Pickett's wagon on a Tuesday morning in October without quite knowing what she was heading toward. It had started, as most things in the Ashcroft household started, with her father wanting money. Franklin Ashcroft was a man who had been cheated by life, or so he believed, and he spent most of his energy making sure the people around him understood this clearly. He'd come to Millhaven County 25 years ago with plans for cattle and had ended up with a middling spread of rocky soil and fence lines that needed constant repair. He had 2 sons, Dale and Roy, who were large and loud and selfish in the way that men become when their father has modeled those qualities enthusiastically. And he had Lydia, who was none of those things, which meant she fit into the Ashcroft household roughly the way a splinter fits into a thumb. She cooked. She mended, she kept the kitchen running and the garden producing and the household from descending into the particular kind of squalor that 3 careless men can generate with remarkable speed. She did all of this without being thanked for it, because the Ashcroft men did not thank women for things they considered basic obligations, and she had long since stopped expecting otherwise. What she had not expected, had not seen coming at all, in fact, was the conversation she'd overheard 3 weeks before that October morning, standing outside the kitchen door with a basket of dried herbs in her arms. "Holloway's looking for a wife." That was Roy's voice, carrying through the thin wall with the ease of a man who never once considered whether he ought to lower his volume. "Put out word last week. Widower, 2 kids, spread out past Garrison Creek. Word is the place is struggling since his wife died." Holloway. Her father's voice, thoughtful in the way it only got when money was somewhere in the vicinity. "What's he offering?" "Nothing formal, but he's got good land, Pa, good water access. Man who marries well out there could do real well for himself." A pause. Then Dale, who was the cleverer of her two brothers in the same way a rock is cleverer than dirt. What about Lydia? She'd gone very still outside that door. What about her? Her father said. She's 23. We're not going to get a decent offer for her. You know that. Nobody around here is going to take her serious. A sound that might have been Dale shifting in his chair. But Holloway doesn't know her. Doesn't know what she looks like. Doesn't know she's, quiet, odd. You're saying send her out there as some kind of... I'm saying let him see what he gets and decide for himself. If he keeps her, we're rid of the problem. If he sends her back in a week, we haven't lost anything. The silence that followed was her father thinking. She knew that silence well. It was the silence of a man calculating. Write him a letter, Franklin Ashcroft said finally. Say she's agreeable and hard-working. Don't mention the rest. She'd stood outside that door for a long moment with the herb basket getting heavier and heavier in her arms. Then she'd gone back to the kitchen and started supper because there wasn't anything else to do. She hadn't confronted them, hadn't argued. What would have been the point? She had no money, no relatives elsewhere who'd have taken her in, no prospects her father hadn't just mentioned with remarkable efficiency. She was 23 years old on a ranch where she was considered a burden, and a man named Garrett Holloway she'd never met was apparently going to decide within the next week or two whether she was worth keeping. The humiliation of it sat in her chest like a stone. But underneath that, where she didn't examine it too closely, was something that might, in a different light, have looked almost like relief. Earl Pickett's 3 other stops took the better part of 2 hours. Lydia sat in the wagon bed and watched Millhaven County pass by in the pale October light. She knew this country well enough, had ridden these roads when she was allowed to, which wasn't often. But there was something different about seeing it from the back of a wagon heading away from home, the way the hills rolled up toward the sky, the dried grass bent flat by last week's wind, the occasional homestead set back from the road with wood smoke rising from the chimney. It looked like a place where a life could be built, if you had the right conditions for it. She wondered what the Holloway place looked like. She wondered what he was like, this widower who'd put out word he needed a wife. She tried to imagine him and couldn't. She'd heard the name, but not much more than that. The Ashcroft family wasn't heavy on neighborly socializing, and what gossip reached them came filtered through Roy's version of events, which wasn't reliable. You nervous? Earl said from the front seat. She considered the question honestly. Some. Garrett Holloway's a decent man, Earl said, with the air of someone who'd been waiting to deliver this piece of information and was glad to finally find a reasonable opening. Lost his wife 2 winters back. Hard on him and the kids. Boys about 9, girls maybe 6 or 7. Ranch got behind while he was grieving. How behind? Earl made a gesture with one hand that could have meant anything. Enough that he needs help. Real help, not just... He seemed to catch himself. Not just someone decorative. Lydia almost smiled at that. Nobody had ever been in danger of describing her as decorative. What happened to his wife, she said. Fever. Came on fast, didn't give much warning. She was a good woman, Martha Holloway. People liked her. Earl paused. She was the kind who made a place feel like itself, you know? Some women do that. Ranch hasn't been the same since. Lydia looked at the road ahead of them, thought about a man trying to hold a grief-soaked homestead together with 2 children, and not enough hands and not enough heart left to do it properly. She thought about that more than she expected to for the rest of the drive. The Holloway spread came into view about 20 minutes past the Garrison Creek crossing, and her first impression was not encouraging. The house was solid enough, good bones, decent size, the kind of structure built to last by someone who knew what they were doing. But the yard was a mess of neglect, a broken fence rail leaning against the post where it had apparently been leaning for some time, a garden plot gone entirely to weeds and dead stalks, a pile of lumber sitting in the open that should have been stacked under cover months ago. The barn door was hanging slightly off true, suggesting a hinge issue that hadn't been addressed. A water trough near the fence line had developed a split and been patched badly with what looked like tar paper and hope. It was, she thought, the property of a man who was doing his best, and whose best was not currently enough. Earl pulled the wagon up near the porch and called out, and after a moment the front door opened. Garrett Holloway was not what she'd built in her head during the drive. She'd imagined. She wasn't sure what she'd imagined. Someone older, maybe. Or someone with the kind of bluster that men in this country sometimes developed as a defense against hardship. The volume and swagger that were supposed to communicate that they were managing fine. Everything was fine. Nobody needed to worry. The man who came down off the porch steps was about 35, she estimated. Medium height, solid, without being heavy, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. Dark hair that needed cutting. A jaw that hadn't been shaved in a couple of days. He walked with a slight favor of his left leg that he probably didn't notice himself doing anymore. Old injury, she guessed. Healed but not completely forgotten by the body. What she noticed most, though, were his eyes. Dark brown, and tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. The kind of tired that lives behind the eyes and doesn't shift just because you got a good night. He looked at Earl first. Then he looked at her, standing in the wagon bed with her flour sack, and for just a moment she saw him absorb the reality of what had arrived at his property versus whatever he'd been expecting. She waited for the expression she knew. The flicker of disappointment or confusion or barely disguised resignation that she'd been seeing on people's faces her whole life. It didn't come. He studied her for a moment, not rudely, more the way a man looks at something he's genuinely trying to understand, and then he said, "Miss Ashcroft." "Mr. Holloway." He came to the side of the wagon and offered her a hand down without being asked. She took it, because it would have been foolish not to, and stepped down to the dirt. Up close, the tired in his eyes was even more pronounced. But there was something else there too, something that hadn't gone out yet. She couldn't name it precisely. Steadiness, maybe. "Earl," he said, without looking away from her. "Thanks for the delivery." "Don't mention it." Earl was already gathering his reins. "I'll be out this way Thursday if either of you need anything sent." Then Earl and his wagon were gone down the road, and Lydia was standing in the yard of a stranger's homestead with everything she owned in a flour sack, and this was her life now. "Are you hungry?" Garrett said. "I've got coffee on." It was such a practical question, delivered so without ceremony, that something in her chest unclenched slightly. "Coffee would be fine," she said. Ditchy. Inside the house was the same story as the yard, functional but suffering. The kitchen was clean enough, cleaner than she'd expected from a man alone, but the kind of clean that meant things were being maintained rather than cared for. A pot on the stove, 2 cups on the table, a window that needed recalking along the bottom edge where the cold was getting in. 2 children were at the table. The boy looked up at her with the direct, measuring gaze of a kid who has learned to assess newcomers carefully. The girl didn't look up at all, sat with her chin tucked down and her hands folded in her lap, a small fortress of a child. "This is Thomas," Garrett said. "He's 9. And that's Clara. She's 7. "Hello," Lydia said. Thomas said, "Hello." Clara said nothing. Garrett poured coffee and set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table with the settled manner of a man who'd been having hard conversations for long enough that he'd stopped prolonging the approach. "I got your father's letter," he said. "Didn't say much about you specifically." "I imagine not." Something in her tone must have registered because he looked at her more carefully. "Should it have?" She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it testing the corners of the house, that low, searching sound it makes when it's serious about getting in. "My family," she said, choosing the words with some precision, "sent me here because they thought you'd send me back. They thought it would be funny." He was quiet for a moment. "Why would they think that?" "Because I'm not what men generally—" She stopped, started again. "They didn't think I was suitable." Garrett looked at her across the table. His coffee sat untouched. Clara still hadn't looked up. Thomas had gone very still in the way that children go still when they understand an adult conversation is happening around them. "Why not?" Garrett said. It was the plainest question anyone had ever asked her about herself, and she found she didn't have a clean answer for it. "They just didn't," she said finally. He nodded slowly, like he was filing this information somewhere. "I'll tell you something," he said. "I've had 3 women come out here in the last 4 months after I put out word I was looking. First one took one look at the state of this place and left inside 2 hours. Second one stayed 3 days, which I appreciated, but she was clear this wasn't what she wanted. Third one—" He stopped, and something passed across his face briefly. She wanted the land more than anything else about the situation, which wasn't a foundation I was interested in building on. And now me, Lydia said. And now you. He looked at her steadily. I'm not interested in a transaction, Miss Ashcroft. I need help, real help. Someone who can work and think and handle this place alongside me. The kids need... He glanced at Clara, who still hadn't moved. They need someone. I won't pretend it's a simple situation. It's not a simple situation for me either, she said. No, I don't suppose it is. He picked up his coffee finally. I'd like you to stay a week and see how you feel about it. See how we all feel about it. No obligations in either direction. If it doesn't suit you, I'll arrange for you to get wherever you want to go. She thought about that. Thought about what waited for her if she went back. Thought about a flour sack and a dirt path and a dog pulling toward the tree line. All right, she said. For the first time, something that might have been a very small, very cautious relief moved across Garrett Holloway's face. All right, he said. Clara finally looked up. Dark eyes, her father's eyes, and in them the same quality of watchful assessment, but also something rawer, more unguarded. She looked at Lydia for a long moment. Then she looked back down at her hands. It was not a welcome, but it wasn't a rejection either, and Lydia, who had been reading the difference between those two things her whole life, understood that it was the most the child could manage right now. She could work with that. The first 3 days were an education in what a property looks like when grief and survival have been fighting each other for 2 years. Lydia moved through the house and outbuildings with the quiet, systematic attention she'd trained herself to apply to any new environment, cataloging, assessing, building a mental list she didn't write down anywhere but kept perfectly ordered in her head. The kitchen garden was a loss for this season, but the soil was decent and the fencing still mostly sound. Come spring, it could be something. The barn needed that hinge fixed, and the hay storage situation was going to be a problem before winter got serious if nobody addressed it soon. The split water trough could be properly repaired rather than just patched, if someone took a morning and did it right. She didn't say any of this out loud immediately. She watched first, watched how Garrett worked, methodically, competently, but in the slightly blinkered way of a man so deep in the immediate demands of running a place alone that he couldn't get perspective on the larger picture. Watched how Thomas moved through his chores, which he did with a 9-year-old's combination of capability and corners cut when nobody's looking. Watched Clara, who helped in the kitchen with a precision that was clearly her mother's training still living in her hands, and who didn't speak to Lydia directly for the first 2 full days. On the 3rd morning, Lydia was in the kitchen before dawn. She was always up before dawn, old habit from years of being first to the stove at the Ashcroft house, working on biscuits when she heard a sound behind her and turned to find Clara standing in the doorway in her nightgown, barefoot on the cold floor. "You're up early," Lydia said. "Couldn't sleep." Clara's voice was small but clear. "What are you making?" "Biscuits. You want to help?" A hesitation. Then Clara crossed the kitchen and climbed onto the stool beside the work table without being asked again. Lydia showed her the motion for cutting the fat into the flour, the particular press and drag that got the right texture. And Clara did it with those same precise hands, watching her own fingers like she was memorizing the movement. They worked side by side in the early quiet. Outside, the sky was beginning to go from black to deep blue, the first gray suggestion of morning starting at the horizon. "My mama made biscuits different," Clara said to the flour. "Most people have their own way," Lydia said. "She put something in them. Something that made them a little sweet. I don't know what it was." Lydia considered. Might have been a pinch of sugar in the dough. Some people do that. Clara looked up at her. "Do you do that?" "I can try it that way and see if it's right." Something in Clara's face shifted. Not warm, not trusting, not yet, but something marginally less defended. She looked back at the biscuit dough. "Okay," she said. It was the longest conversation they'd had. Lydia added a small pinch of sugar to the next batch, and when the biscuits came out of the oven, Clara ate 2 of them without saying anything, which felt, in its own quiet way, like something. The 4th night, a storm rolled in from the northwest, the kind that announces itself an hour before arrival by dropping the temperature 10 degrees and turning the air that particular electric quality that makes horses nervous. Lydia heard the horses before anyone else did. She was already half awake, that light sleeper's awareness of weather she'd developed in the exposed Ashcroft Ranch, where a bad storm could take a roof section if you weren't paying attention. She got up, pulled on her boots and coat over her nightdress, and went out to the barn. The horses were moving in their stalls, that sideways, restless shuffling that meant they were working themselves toward panic. She went to the nearest one first, a bay mare named Cedar, who was rolling her eyes white and bumping her hindquarters against the stall wall, and put her hand flat on the mare's neck and started talking. Low, steady, nothing in particular, just the rhythm of a voice that wasn't afraid. She was still there 20 minutes later, Cedar's head dropped now, breathing evening out, when she heard the barn door open behind her. Garrett came in with a lantern. He stopped when he saw her. She was in her nightdress and coat, her hair loose and unbrushed, mud on her boots from the yard. Not exactly a dignified picture. She straightened slightly and kept her hand on Cedar's neck. "I heard them," she said as explanation. He looked at the mare, at how she was standing calm in the stall, which she clearly hadn't been recently, given the disturbed bedding. Then he looked at Lydia. "I've been trying to get her settled for 20 minutes some nights," he said. "She just needs—" Lydia thought about how to explain it. "She needs to know someone's not scared. They can feel it if you are." He came further into the barn, checked the other horses. The geldings were still slightly wound up, but Cedar's calm was starting to spread, the way calm does in a herd when one animal decides things are manageable. He stood at the stall door beside Lydia and watched the mare for a moment. "Where'd you learn horses?" he said. "Same place I learned everything else. Just watching and figuring it out." Outside, the storm hit properly. Rain first, then something heavier. Hail, maybe. The barn roof taking the assault in that different voice. The lantern swayed slightly. Cedar shifted but didn't spook. "Your family's letter," Garrett said, not looking at her, still watching the horse. "Said you were agreeable and hardworking. That was generous of them. What would you have said if they'd asked you to write your own letter?" She thought about it. The hail was loud on the roof. Cedar had dropped her head to the hay now, done with drama. "That I'm not easy to get to know," she said. "That I work hard because I find it better than not working. That I'm not—" She paused. "That I don't have a lot of softness about me. Not the kind that shows." He turned then and looked at her, really looked, the way she'd noticed he did, that direct considering attention. "I've been on this ranch with Soft, and it didn't save me anything," he said, quiet, not cruel. "My wife. Martha was kind in the way that lights up a room. I'm not going to pretend I don't miss that." Lydia held very still. "But Soft doesn't fix a split water trough," he said. "And Soft doesn't calm a horse in a storm. And Soft doesn't get up before sunrise to make biscuits with a little girl who hasn't eaten a proper breakfast since her mother died." He looked away. "I notice things, Miss Ashcroft. It's about all I'm still good at." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed to be said. The storm tore at the roof for another hour. They stayed in the barn until the worst of it passed, not talking much, just tending to the horses when they needed it and standing in the lantern light when they didn't. It was not comfortable, exactly. Too much unsaid between them, too many things still unresolved, two strangers in a barn at midnight with a week to decide if they could build something out of necessity and uncertainty. But it was real. That was something. When she finally went back to the house, mud on her boots and hay in her hair, and the storm still grumbling in the distance, she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the flour sack hanging on the peg, where she'd put it when she arrived. All her possessions still packed inside it because she hadn't yet let herself fully unpack. She reached up and took it down, pulled out the spare dress, the extra stockings, the small tin box that had her mother's thimble in it, and nothing else. Set them out on the shelf beside the basin. It wasn't a decision, not really. It wasn't even hope, which was too large and too dangerous a thing to let herself feel yet. It was just the barest beginning of something. The way you put a cracked seed in the ground and don't yet know if the weather will hold. She set the empty flour sack aside and lay down and listened to the rain, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without listening for her father's voice telling her she'd done something wrong. The week Garrett had offered her stretched into 2 and then 3, and somewhere in that third week Lydia stopped counting, not because she'd forgotten, but because the counting had started to feel beside the point. There was too much work to do, and work had always been the thing that organized her days better than calendars did. The hay storage problem got addressed first. She spent a full morning with Thomas reorganizing the barn loft, moving the newer bales to the back and the older ones forward, covering the whole stack properly with the tarpaulin that had been sitting folded in the corner, apparently waiting for someone to remember it existed. Thomas worked without complaining, which she appreciated, and only tried to cut one corner, which she caught and corrected without making a production of it. "My pa never does it that way," Thomas said, when she showed him the proper overlap for the tarp. "How does your pa do it?" Thomas thought about it. "Faster. Faster isn't always better." He considered this with the deep philosophical seriousness of a 9-year-old being told something that contradicts established household doctrine. "He'd probably say it is," Thomas said finally. "You could tell him I said different and see what he says." Thomas grinned, the first real grin she'd gotten from him, and went back to work. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, she'd figured out, though she'd only known Martha Holloway through the small evidence she'd left behind. The quilt folded at the foot of Clara's bed, the particular way the kitchen shelves were organized, the dried flower arrangement on the windowsill that nobody had moved in 2 years, and that Lydia had carefully dusted around rather than disturb. The water trough was next. She drained it, pulled off the bad patch job, let the wood dry out for a day, and then sealed it properly with the pitch she found in the supply shed. Garrett came out while she was in the middle of it and stood there for a moment watching her work, and she could feel him deciding whether to say something. "I was going to get to that," he said. "I know. There's been a lot, Garrett." She didn't look up from the seam she was sealing. "I'm not criticizing. I'm just fixing it." Another pause. She heard him shift his weight. "You don't have to do all the outside work, too," he said, and there was something uncomfortable in his voice, not quite embarrassment, but adjacent to it. The particular discomfort of a man who has been raised to believe certain things belong in certain categories and is watching those categories get rearranged in front of him. "The outside work needs doing," she said simply. He didn't argue, but later that afternoon she looked up from the fence rail she was checking and saw him rehanging the barn door hinge, properly this time, getting the alignment right, and she understood that was his version of a response. They communicated a lot that way, in the first weeks, in tasks rather than words. The neighbors arrived at the end of October, which Lydia had not been prepared for. It wasn't unfriendly exactly. It was just the frontier version of assessment. People who'd heard that Garrett Holloway had a woman out at his place and had decided, individually and apparently by some coordinated instinct, that this particular Tuesday was a good day to drop by with a covered dish and see for themselves. First came Vera Hutchins from the neighboring spread, a big-boned woman of about 50 with sharp eyes, and the kind of directness that had probably started as a personality trait and been refined by decades of frontier living into something close to an art form. She handed over a pot of soup, looked Lydia up and down with the thoroughness of someone conducting an audit, and said, "You're younger than I expected." "I get that sometimes," Lydia said. Vera made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Kitchen's in better shape than it was last time I was here. That you?" "Mostly." Vera sat down at the kitchen table without being invited and accepted the coffee Lydia poured her. "Garrett's been struggling since Martha passed. Hate to see a good man go under because he can't keep a household and a ranch running at the same time. No shame in it, just reality." Lydia sat across from her. "I know. You planning on staying?" It was a blunter version of the question she'd been asking herself every night before sleep. "I'm planning on today," she said. "The rest I'll figure out." Vera studied her for another moment, then nodded once, decisively, as though Lydia had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. The Breckett brothers came by an hour after Vera left. 2 men in their 40s, ranchers from 2 miles west, and it was immediately clear they fell into a different category than Vera. They were polite enough on the surface, the way men are polite when they want to look at something they privately think is amusing. She caught one of them, the taller one, Frank, glancing at the other with a particular expression when they thought she wasn't looking. A private exchange, something between amusement and condescension, the kind of look that said they'd already made up their minds about what they were seeing. Garrett was in the yard with them, she was inside the kitchen, and she could hear pieces of the conversation. "Stepped up, have you, Garrett? Couldn't find anyone closer to home?" And then Frank's voice, lower, but not low enough. "Not what I'd have picked, I'll say that." She kept her hands moving. She was rolling biscuit dough again. She'd discovered that she made biscuits when she was working through something, had probably made more biscuits in 3 weeks at this ranch than in the previous year at home. Her hands knew the work, and her mind could go somewhere else. She heard Garrett say something, too quiet to catch. Then the Breckett brothers' voices shifted, still joking but slightly more careful, and then they left, and Garrett came in. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter with his back to her for a moment. "You heard that," he said. Not a question. "Some of it." He turned around. His jaw was doing something tight that she'd noticed it did when he was holding something in. "I want to say—" "Don't," she said. "Please." "Lydia, I've heard worse from my own family." She looked at him steadily. "I don't need you to apologize for other people. I just need you to not agree with them." Something moved across his face, something that was working harder than she could see. "I don't agree with them," he said, flat and simple. "Then that's enough," she said, and went back to the biscuits. He stood there another moment, and she could feel him wanting to say more, and choosing not to. And she thought that showed a kind of good judgment that she was quietly coming to appreciate in him. Some men, when they wanted to make something better, kept talking until they made it worse. Garrett seemed to understand when the moment had said what it needed to say. November came in gray and cold, and with it the kind of sustained difficult weather that tests what a place is actually made of. The first heavy frost took out what remained of the garden, not that there'd been much left, but the few late greens Lydia had been nursing along went overnight, blackened and limp by morning. She pulled them up and turned the soil anyway, working in the manure she'd been composting from the barn, preparing the beds for spring in the grinding, methodical way that any real investment requires. You do the work before you see the benefit, often long before. Clara started helping her in the garden around the second week of November. Not talking much, just working alongside her in her small, serious way, pulling dead roots and breaking up the clods of soil with a focus that seemed disproportionate to the size of her hands. She'd started talking a little more in the kitchen, not volumes, not the chatterbox some children her age could be, but a word here, a question there, a small offered piece of herself that she seemed to calculate carefully before extending. One afternoon she asked, "Did you have a garden at your house before?" "Yes," Lydia said. "Was it nice?" Lydia thought about the garden at the Ashcroft place, the one she'd kept going for years against the indifference of the rest of the household, coaxing vegetables out of mediocre soil because if she didn't, the kitchen suffered for it in winter. "It was adequate," she said. Clara considered this. Adequate means okay? Means it did what it needed to do. "This garden could be better than adequate," Clara said with a 7-year-old's complete confidence. Mama had roses along the south fence. They died after she did. Lydia looked at the section of fence Clara meant. The dead canes were still there, brittle gray sticks poking up from the ground. She'd assumed they were something she'd need to pull out eventually. "What kind of roses?" "Pink ones. Not fancy. Just—" Clara made a shape with her hands that was clearly meant to communicate a particular kind of simple open bloom. "Regular roses." "We could try to put new ones in come spring," Lydia said. "Along the same fence, if that's where they did well." Clara's hands dropped. She looked at the fence line, then at Lydia with that dark assessing gaze. "Would you still be here in spring?" she said. It was the most direct question anyone on this ranch had asked her, and it came from the 7-year-old, which shouldn't have surprised her as much as it did. She sat back on her heels in the cold dirt and looked at this child who had already lost more than a child her age should have to lose, and she understood that she owed her an honest answer, not a comforting one. "I'd like to be," she said. "I'm not going anywhere I can see right now." Clara held her gaze for another moment. Then she went back to breaking up soil clods, her small hands working with that precise maternal inheritance. "Okay," she said, but The trouble at the feed supply in Millhaven came on a Thursday in mid-November, when Garrett took the wagon in for supplies and brought Lydia along because the list was long and the boxes heavy, and because he'd been finding reasons to have her alongside him more often, in a way he probably hadn't examined too closely yet. She noticed the change in atmosphere the moment they pulled up in front of Dawson's store. It wasn't dramatic, nothing as obvious as people stopping in the street to stare. It was subtler than that. The particular quality of awareness that a small town generates when it has already discussed something and is now observing its subject in real time. Old Man Dawson was fine with her, pleasant enough, same as always, helped them through the supply list without any visible agenda. It was the group of men on the porch of the barber shop across the road that she was conscious of. 3 of them. Ranchers she recognized by type, if not by name. Men of comfortable establishment. The kind who'd been in this valley long enough to feel they had opinions on how things should go. She didn't hear what they said. She didn't need to. Garrett loaded the wagon with the deliberate focus of a man choosing to look at what's in front of him rather than across the street, and she helped without comment, and they got through it. It was on the way out of town that they passed Ruth Emery, who ran the dry goods store with her husband, and who was one of those women who believed she was offering a kindness when she was actually offering a verdict. Ruth stopped them, called out to Garrett with that particular brightness that meant she had something she wanted to say and had been waiting for the opportunity. "Garrett, good to see you. And this must be—" She looked at Lydia with an expression that was perfectly cordial on the surface and perfectly assessing underneath. "How are you settling in, dear?" "Well, thank you," Lydia said. "Good, good." Ruth's eyes moved between them, cataloging. "We were all a little surprised, you know, when we heard. We'd expected Garrett might, well, a small laugh, the laugh that isn't really a laugh. We all just want what's best for him and the children, of course." "Of course," Lydia said. She felt Garrett tense slightly beside her, felt him start to draw breath for something, a correction maybe or a defense, and she put her hand on his forearm briefly, just a touch, just enough to communicate. "Let it go." He did. Ruth smiled her bright social smile and said something about the weather and moved on, and they drove out of town in silence for a while with the cold air coming off the hills and the horses moving at their steady road pace. "I'm sorry," Garrett said eventually. "Ruth Emery will think what she thinks," Lydia said. "She was going to think it whether I was there or not. It's not right. No." She looked at the road ahead of them. "It's not. But it's not the worst thing I've dealt with, Garrett. I grew up in a house where they said worse, and they meant it. Ruth Emery doesn't mean me any particular harm. She searched for the right word. She just can't see past what she expects to see." He was quiet for another long stretch. The wagon creaked over a rough section of road, and he steadied the horses without thinking about it, that automatic competence of someone who has been driving this particular road in this particular wagon long enough that his hands know it. "What did you expect," he said, "when Earl's wagon brought you out here? What did you think you were going to find?" She thought about it honestly. "I didn't let myself expect much. It seemed safer." "And what did you find?" She looked at the hills, at the dried grass bent flat by the wind, at the slice of late afternoon sky going pale above the ridgeline. "More than I expected," she said, which was the truest answer she had, and also the most she was ready to say. He didn't push it, just nodded, slowly, and kept his eyes on the road. But she saw his hands relax slightly on the reins, and that said enough. Yeah. The real test came on a Saturday evening in late November, when a storm moved through faster than predicted and caught Lydia in the far pasture with the 2 younger horses. She'd taken them out for exercise in the afternoon. They'd been cooped up in the barn for 3 days running and were getting that coiled spring energy that meant trouble if you didn't address it. And she'd misjudged the speed of the weather rolling in off the northwest ridge. By the time the sky turned that particular sulphurous yellow-gray that meant serious business, she was half a mile from the barn with 2 horses that were already picking up the atmospheric change and starting to jitter. She didn't panic. Panic with horses is a gift you give them, and they never use it well. She kept her voice and her body both steady, deliberately loose in her shoulders, deliberately measured in her movements, and she talked them back toward the barn the long way around, avoiding the narrow section of fence line where the footing was bad, taking the wider path that added 5 minutes to the walk but kept the ground reliable under them. The first real gust of wind hit when she was about 200 yards out, and the bay gelding, less steady than Cedar, always had been, went sideways and nearly pulled the lead rope through her hands. She held on. Both hands, full grip, feet planted in the dirt, leaning back against the pull. "Hey," she said, the same tone she used with Cedar in the barn that first storm night. Not commanding, just present. "Hey, you're all right." He wasn't all right for another 30 seconds, all white eyes and bunched muscle. Then something shifted in him, that moment when a frightened animal decides to trust rather than flee, and his feet came back under him and he stopped pulling. She got them both to the barn as the first lightning hit the ridge to the northwest, and she had them stalled and settled and the barn doors secured by the time the full storm arrived, which it did with considerable commitment. Lightning and thunder nearly simultaneous, rain in horizontal sheets, the kind of storm that makes you understand why the people out here built their barns as solid as they built their houses. Garrett found her in the barn when the worst of it had passed enough to move. He came in with the lantern and the specific expression of a man who has been standing at a window watching a storm and doing the arithmetic on where someone he's responsible for might be in it. "You're all right," he said. Also not a question. "I'm all right." She was sitting on a hay bale, somewhat damp from the run across the yard. Her hair had come half loose from its pin, and her boots were muddy, and she was still catching her breath from the exertion of holding on to a panicked gelding. Garrett hung the lantern on the hook and sat down on the hay bale across from her. He looked at her for a moment, at her disheveled state, at the horses in their stalls breathing steady, at the barn properly secured around them, and the expression on his face was one she didn't have immediate language for. "Thomas told me what you did with the hay storage," he said. "When?" "Tonight, when we were watching the storm. He said you showed him how to do the tarp right. Made him redo the section he'd rushed." He folded his hands between his knees. "He said you didn't make him feel stupid about it." She shrugged slightly. "He's 9. He was doing his best. His best was a corner cut that would have cost us hay if that storm had come through a week ago." "I know. That's why I made him redo it." Garrett looked at his hands, then at her again. "He doesn't take correction well," he said. "From me, he gets his back up. Has since last year. I don't know if it's his age or if it's—" He stopped. "Since Martha died, things between us have been harder. I don't know how much is grief and how much is just the growing." She thought about Thomas that morning in the barn loft, that first grin. "He just needs to feel like he's capable," she said. "Not managed. There's a difference." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "You're good with them," he said. It came out almost reluctant, not because he didn't mean it, but the way something comes out reluctant when a person has held it back long enough that saying it feels like giving something away. "With Clara, with Thomas, I didn't expect that." "What did you expect?" He looked at her across the hay bale in the lantern light, with the storm still making noise outside and the horses settling behind them, and he said, "I don't know exactly, not this." She didn't answer right away. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease, the lightning moving east toward the valley floor. She could hear Clara's voice occasionally when the wind paused. She was up in the house with Thomas, probably standing at the window watching the sky, which was what kids did. "Frank Breckett said something to you," she said, "the day they came by, about me. I heard you answer him, but I couldn't hear what you said." Garrett straightened slightly. "I told him to mind his own concerns." "That's all?" "I told him," he said, with a new quality in his voice, something that had some iron in it, "that what he thought about who I chose to have at my ranch was something I had no interest in discussing with him." She looked at him for a long moment. The lantern swayed slightly in a draft from the barn door. "Thank you," she said. "I should have said it louder," he said. She shook her head. "It wasn't for their benefit. It was for mine." He held her gaze and she held his, and it was one of those moments that doesn't announce itself, but that, while it's happening, which is rare, is a kind of line. Something on one side of it, something different on the other. Then Garrett stood, reached down, and offered her a hand up off the hay bale. She took it, same as that first day in the yard. Practical, because it would have been foolish not to. But this time when she was on her feet, he didn't let go right away. Just held on for a moment, in the loose, warm grip of a man who's made a decision he hasn't put words to yet. And then he did let go and picked up the lantern and said, "Come on, let's get in before the cold settles." She followed him across the yard in the rain-washed dark, her boots finding the path she'd already memorized, the house lights warm and steady ahead of them. Inside, she could see Clara's silhouette at the window, watching for them. The girl stepped back when they came through the door, and Lydia caught the expression on her face just before she rearranged it back into that careful composure, something quick and raw and relieved, the face of a child who has already lost one person and does not take the return of another for granted. Lydia hung her wet coat on the peg by the door. Her hands were still a little shaky from the adrenaline of holding on to that panicked gelding in the wind, though she hadn't mentioned that and didn't plan to. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the stew she'd put on before going out to the pasture. It had been sitting low on the stove and was fine, still good. She set about getting bowls out without being asked, and Thomas came in from the other room drawn by the smell, and Garrett built up the fire, and Clara stood at the table watching everything with those dark, observant eyes. And it was not a family yet. She knew that. She wasn't foolish enough to call it that yet. But it was something that was beginning to have the shape of one. And that night, for the second time since she'd arrived, she slept without listening for her father's voice. December came and the valley settled into the particular stillness of deep winter, the kind that muffles sound and slows everything to its essential core. The Holloway Ranch looked different under frost. The broken places less visible, the solid structures more pronounced, as if the cold had done what Lydia had been working toward and revealed what was actually worth keeping. She and Garrett had not discussed the hand in the barn. Not directly. But something had shifted in the way they moved around each other, less careful, less formally polite, the way two people stop performing consideration and just start having it. He brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked, setting the cup on the counter beside where she worked without interrupting her. She started leaving his supper plate covered on the stove on the nights he stayed out late with the horses rather than calling him in, understanding that he needed to work at his own pace and that a covered plate was a more useful thing than a summoning. Thomas had started talking to her the way he talked to people he'd decided were permanent, which was to say constantly and about everything. The unfairness of certain chores, the specific merits of various horses, a disagreement he was having with a boy from a neighboring homestead about which was faster over rough terrain, a quarter horse or a paint. She listened and occasionally offered opinions, and he took them with the same selective consideration he applied to his father's opinions, which she'd come to understand was his highest form of respect. Clara had moved from adequate to something warmer, in the quiet, incremental way that was her nature. She'd started saving small things for Lydia, a smooth stone she'd found near the creek, a feather from the yard, once a drawing she'd done of the horses in their stalls that she left on Lydia's pillow without any note or comment, as though she wanted the gesture without the vulnerability of being present when it was received. Lydia kept all of it. The stone and the feather and the drawing went on the shelf next to her mother's thimble, and she said nothing about it to Clara directly, but she made sure she was in the kitchen when Clara came looking to see if they were still there. They were a kind of family in the way that things become kinds of things before they become the thing itself. Not complete, not named, but present, and getting more solid by the week, which was exactly when her father showed up. She saw the horses first. She was in the garden plot turning the winter compost, hard work in December ground, the soil reluctant and cold, when she caught movement at the road. 2 horses. She knew them before she consciously registered why. The roan her father favored and Dale's gray. Her body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature before her mind had finished processing what her eyes were reporting. She straightened up slowly, set the fork down against the fence post, wiped her hands on her work apron. Franklin Ashcroft and Dale rode into the yard like men who expected to be accommodated, which was the way they rode everywhere. Roy wasn't with them. Roy was the one who needed to see a thing happen rather than make it happen, which told her this had been organized enough to leave a witness behind. Her father dismounted with the careful management of a man whose knees had gotten worse and who refused to acknowledge this. and he looked around the yard with the proprietary survey of a man inventorying something he considered his. Then he looked at her, standing at the garden fence with dirt on her hands, and his expression was the one she'd been reading her whole life. Assessment first, warmth never. "Lydia," he said. "Papa." The word came out flatter than she intended, or maybe exactly as flat as she intended. "You look—" He tilted his head slightly, cataloging the same way he always did, deciding what to report and what to withhold. "You look like you've been working hard." "I have been." Dale had dismounted too and was looking around the yard with a different kind of attention, the fence line, the barn, the general state of the property. She knew what he was doing. He was measuring. "Nice enough spread," Dale said. "Better water access than I thought." She said nothing to that. Her father cleared his throat, which was what he did when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. "We came to see how you're settling in. Make sure things are satisfactory." "Things are fine," she said. "Good, good." He looked at the house, then back at her. "I'd like to speak with Holloway." "What about?" "That's between me and him." The kitchen door opened and Garrett came out. He'd seen them from inside. She knew because he'd had exactly enough time to come out without hurrying, which meant he'd been watching long enough to make a decision about how to approach this before he opened the door. He came down the porch steps and across the yard with that slight favor of his left leg, and he looked at her first, a quick direct look that was asking a question, and she gave him the smallest shake of her head, which he read correctly. "Mr. Ashcroft," he said. He didn't offer his hand. "What brings you out this way?" "Family business," Franklin said. "I'd like to speak to you about my daughter's situation." "Her situation seems fine to me." "That's not for you to decide, Holloway. Lydia's arrangements are my concern. She's my daughter." "She's a grown woman," Garrett said. His voice was even, which she recognized as more dangerous than heated. "She came here of her own." "She came here because we arranged it," Franklin said, and something had shifted in his tone, the rehearsed civility dropping away to reveal the harder thing underneath. "A temporary arrangement. We've had time to reconsider." Lydia looked at her father. "Reconsider what, exactly?" "Your situation. This—" He gestured at the yard, at Garrett, at all of it. "This arrangement isn't formal. You're living here without— We're not married yet, if that's what you're working toward," she said. "That's between Garrett and me." "You're living on a man's property without formal standing," Franklin said, and his voice had taken on the resonance he used when he wanted something to sound righteous. "That reflects on the family." She felt something cold move through her that wasn't the December air. "The family," she said. "The family that sent me out here in a wagon without telling me what you expected to happen. The family that told Garrett the bare minimum in a letter because you assumed he'd send me back inside a week." Franklin's jaw tightened. "That's not— Don't." She took a step toward him, and she saw him register it, the fact that she'd stepped toward him instead of away. "Don't revise it now. I know exactly what the plan was. Roy wasn't quiet enough about it, and neither were you." Dale said, "Lydia," in the warning tone older brothers use when they want to remind you of your place. "Don't," she said to Dale, which she had never in her life said to him before with that particular edge. Garrett had gone very still beside her. She was aware of him with the specific awareness she'd developed over 2 months of working alongside him, the particular quality of his stillness when he was deciding something. "Mr. Ashcroft," Garrett said, "why don't you tell me what you actually came here for?" Franklin looked at him, then at Lydia, then back at Garrett, and the proprietary survey in his eyes sharpened into something more direct. "I came to bring my daughter home," he said. "She's a single woman living on a man's property without legal standing. That's not a situation I'm comfortable allowing to continue." "Allowing," Lydia said. "She's my daughter." "I'm 23 years old," she said. Her voice had gone quiet in the way her voice went quiet when she was past the point of performance, past the point of managing what came out. "I have been cooking and cleaning and mending for your household since I was 13 without being paid for it, or thanked for it, or once, not once, being treated like I had any value beyond what work I could do. You sent me out here like a piece of furniture you were trying to unload on someone who didn't know better. And now that it turns out I'm doing well, She stopped, drew a breath. Now you want me back? Franklin's face had gone through several expressions in quick succession. He landed on the one that had always worked best on her, the wronged patriarch, the misunderstood father. Lydia, whatever you think of how things were handled, I'm not going back, she said. Silence. The kind that has weight. Dale shifted his feet. You don't just get to... Yes, she said. I do. She hadn't known she was going to say it until she said it, but the moment it was out, she understood it was the truest sentence she'd produced in 23 years. Not performed, not argued into. Just the plain fact of it, standing in cold December air in a yard she'd been tending for 2 months, with her hands dirty and her back sore and everything she'd built here at her back. Garrett moved then. One step that put him at her side, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold, and he said, Lydia stays because she chooses to stay. That's the only reason that matters on this property. Franklin looked at him with the look of a man recalibrating his approach. Holloway, I understand you've got a struggling situation here. 2 kids, a ranch that's gotten behind. My daughter's been useful to you, I can see that. But you don't have a legal arrangement. If she stays here without proper standing, people are going to... People are already talking, Garrett said. That doesn't concern me the way you think it does. It should concern you, and it should concern you that her family isn't in agreement with this. Her family sent her here as a joke, Garrett said, and something in his voice had changed now, still controlled, but with an edge underneath it like cold metal. They sent her out here expecting her to fail, expecting me to take one look and turn her around. I read that letter, Mr. Ashcroft. It said she was agreeable and hardworking. Didn't say anything else because you didn't think anything else was worth saying. He held Franklin's gaze and didn't look away. She's the best thing that's happened to this ranch in 2 years, to my kids, and I am not sending her back to a house that treated her like a burden because you've decided your family's reputation matters now. Franklin stared at him. Beside him, Dale had gone quiet in the way that large men sometimes go quiet when they encounter a resistance they hadn't anticipated. It was Clara who broke the silence. Lydia hadn't noticed the girl come out of the house, but there she was on the porch steps, wrapped in her coat, watching the yard with those dark, precise eyes. Is Lydia leaving? She said. Nobody answered immediately. Is she? Clara looked at her father. Her voice was steady, but her hands were gripping the porch rail. No, Garrett said. He didn't look away from Franklin when he said it. Clara looked at the visitors, at Franklin, at Dale, with the complete undiplomatic assessment of a 7-year-old who has already decided what she thinks. Then she went back inside and closed the door, which was its own kind of statement. Franklin Ashcroft looked at the closed door, at Garrett, at Lydia. And Lydia watched her father do the arithmetic, saw the moment he landed on the calculation that this particular confrontation was not going the direction he'd planned. This isn't settled, he said, but the conviction had gone out of it slightly. It is from where I'm standing, Lydia said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she made herself hold it. The familiar weight of his assessment, the practiced patience he'd used on her for years, waiting for her to buckle. She didn't buckle. She stood in the dirt of Garrett Holloway's yard with compost on her hands, and she looked her father in the eye, and she waited. Franklin Ashcroft remounted his horse. Dale followed. Her father looked down at her from the saddle with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not quite fury, not quite something else. Some combination of emotions too mixed to read cleanly. You'll come to your senses, he said. The old confidence, the old certainty that she was ultimately his to manage. Goodbye, Papa, she said. They rode out. She watched them go until the horses were small shapes on the road, then smaller, then nothing. Garrett let out a breath beside her. You all right? I don't know yet. She looked down at her hands, still dirty from the garden. They were steady, which surprised her slightly. I will be. He nodded. Didn't try to tell her she was fine or that it was over, because he was smart enough to know it wasn't over, and she wasn't quite fine. He just stood beside her in the cold and let the silence be what it was. He'll come back, she said. Probably. He doesn't take no the first time. I figured that, Garrett said. We'll deal with it when he does. The we of it landed somewhere in her chest and sat there, warm and unannounced. She was right that her father would come back. She hadn't anticipated he'd bring the valley with him. It took 2 weeks, which was how long it took Franklin Ashcroft to decide that failing quietly was unacceptable, and that a public approach would be more effective. She heard about it from Vera Hutchins, who rode out on a Wednesday with a purpose in her eyes that meant information she'd decided Lydia needed. "Your father's been talking," Vera said, accepting her coffee with the directness of someone who doesn't waste time on preamble. "In town. To Dawson, to the Brecketts, to anyone who'll listen. Saying Holloway's got a situation out here that's not proper, that his daughter is being—" She pressed her lips together briefly. "Kept is the word he's using." Lydia set her coffee cup down carefully. "Kept. It's getting traction with some people. Not everyone. Plenty of folks around here know Franklin Ashcroft for what he is. But enough." Vera looked at her steadily. "Ruth Emery's stopped defending you, which she wasn't doing much of anyway, but still. And the Breckett brothers are repeating your father's version like it's scripture." "What do they think it accomplishes?" Lydia said. "Even if people believe him, what does he want to come of it?" "He wants you shamed into coming back," Vera said simply. "He wants the community to do his work for him. He knows he can't force you out here, so he's going to try to make things uncomfortable enough that you leave on your own. Or—" She paused, and her expression shifted slightly. "Or he makes things hard enough for Garrett that Garrett decides you're not worth the trouble." The last part landed in the room and sat there. Lydia looked at her coffee, thought about Garrett at the feed store, about the Breckett brothers on the porch, about Ruth Emery and her bright social smile, thought about how much damage a man could do with words in a tight-knit valley community if he was patient about it and didn't mind the truth too much. "Garrett needs this community," she said, "for the ranch. He needs suppliers and buyers and neighbors who'll lend a hand in hard seasons." "Yes," Vera said. She understood what Vera was telling her without spelling it out. That whatever her father was doing wasn't just about her. It was about making the math of keeping her too costly. A man with a struggling ranch couldn't afford to be a social liability. If the valley turned against him, or enough of it did, the practical damage could be serious. Vera was watching her think. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I don't know yet," Lydia said, "but I'm not leaving." Vera nodded, once, with the small, satisfied expression of a woman who'd wanted to hear a particular answer and had gotten it. "Good," she said, and picked up her coffee again. She told Garrett that night. She didn't soften it or present it carefully. She just told him what Vera had said, plainly, while he was sitting at the kitchen table with the account ledger open in front of him, which was where he sat most evenings now, going through the numbers with the patient attention of a man trying to find extra room that may or may not be there. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat for a moment looking at the ledger, then closed it. "Your father's a careful man," he said. "He is. Coming out here directly, that didn't work because I'm on my own property and you made your position clear. So he takes it to the community instead, where I don't have the same ground to stand on." He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "That's a smarter play than I expected from him." "He's not stupid," Lydia said. "He's just—" She thought about how to say it. "He's a man who thinks he's owed things. That makes him predictable, but it doesn't make him slow." Garrett looked at her. "Does it worry you? What people will say?" She thought about that honestly. "Not for myself. I stopped needing people's approval a long time ago. I had to." She held his gaze. "But I'm worried about what it costs you. The ranch is my problem," he said. "Not yours to fix." "It became mine when I stayed," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table, and something moved through his expression that was complicated and unresolved. Not unhappy, just the look of a man for whom something is becoming clear that he's been working toward for weeks. "Lydia," he said, then stopped. "What?" "I've been thinking." He opened the ledger again, then closed it again, which told her his mind wasn't actually on the ledger. "About what makes sense, formally. What your father's saying, it's wrong about everything important, but he's not wrong that there's no formal arrangement here. And that gives other people room to say things that they wouldn't be able to say if there was." He looked at her directly. "I'm not saying this right." "You're doing fine," she said. "I'm not asking because of your father," he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking because of what people are saying or what it would do to the situation. I'm asking because he stopped again, looked at his hands, then at her. Because the last 2 months you've been, another stop. He made a frustrated sound. I'm not good at this. I know, she said. Keep going. I want you to stay, he said. Permanently, for good. Not because the ranch needs you, though it does. Not because the kids need you, though they do. He held her gaze steadily, the tired in his eyes present, but behind it, something that had been building since a barn in a storm and a hand not let go quite immediately enough. Because I'd like to try. Building something with you, that's what I'm saying, if you'd be willing. It was not a romantic declaration in the traditional sense. There were no particular flourishes to it. It was a man at a kitchen table with a ledger he'd been staring at for weeks, and a property that was slowly coming back to life, and 2 children who had started to show their faces more freely than they had in 2 years, asking a woman if she'd stay. She looked at him for a long moment, thought about flour sacks and wagon rides, and the first morning she'd seen this place, the broken fence rail, the tilted barn door, the garden gone to weeds. Thought about a storm and a panicked gelding and a hand held just a moment longer than necessary. Thought about Clara's drawing on her pillow and Thomas's first grin and coffee set on the counter in the morning without being asked. Yes, she said. Just that. Not decorated. Not explained. Garrett let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding longer than just this conversation. Okay, he said. Okay. She looked at the closed ledger. You should finish the accounts. He almost smiled. Right. He opened it again. She got up to bank the fire for the night, and they stayed in the kitchen companionably in the ordinary quiet of 2 people who have said something large and are now returning to the practical, which is what ordinary large things eventually require. They rode into Millhaven together on the first Friday of December, and she understood when they arrived that Garrett had been planning this. He'd sent word ahead. She didn't know to whom until she saw them. Earl Pickett was there, and Vera Hutchins, and Old Man Dawson, and several others whose faces she'd learned over 2 months of supply runs and chance encounters. Not a crowd, a dozen people, maybe 15, but placed around the center of town with the deliberate casualness of people who had been asked to be somewhere and had chosen to oblige. Franklin Ashcroft was in front of the feed store. He'd apparently been in town already. Bad timing for him, good timing for what Garrett had in mind, and she suspected Garrett had known he'd be there. Garrett stopped the wagon in the center of the road, in the open, where everyone could see, and he helped Lydia down and stood beside her with the particular quality of a man who has decided something and is done being quiet about it. Franklin, he said, loud enough to carry. Not a shout, just a voice that knew it was being heard. Her father looked up from his conversation near the feed store door. His expression went carefully neutral in the way of a man who knows he's about to be engaged in a public setting and is quickly calculating his position. I want to say something that I should have said 2 weeks ago, Garrett said. He wasn't performing. He wasn't giving a speech, he was just talking, which made it worse for Franklin and better for everyone else. In front of people who've known both of us, because you've been saying things about Lydia and about my household, and I've let those things sit too long without answer. Franklin said, Holloway, this isn't the place. It's exactly the place because you made it the place, Garrett said. You've been going around this valley telling people your daughter is being kept, that she's not got proper standing, that I've got some disreputable situation out there. He looked at the people around them, not aggressively, just including them. So let me tell the actual truth since we're all here. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a folded paper. I spoke with Judge Alderman in Cavalry Creek yesterday. We've filed the first papers. We'll be married by the end of the month. He looked at Franklin. Your daughter has proper standing. She has had proper standing since the day she chose to stay, because that was her choice to make. But if formal documentation is what settles the matter for people who need documentation, here it is. He held up the paper without making a production of it, just held it where it could be seen. Franklin Ashcroft stood in front of the feed store with his son beside him and the valley watching, and for the first time in Lydia's life she saw her father in a moment he hadn't controlled. His face moved through several things in quick succession, anger first, then calculation, then the specific look of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it. "She's my daughter," he said, and the certainty in his voice had thinned. "She's her own person," Garrett said. "Same as she's always been. You just didn't notice." Lydia stood beside Garrett and did not look at her father with triumph, because that had never been what she wanted from him. What she felt was something more complicated. The specific grief of recognizing that a man who should have been something different had simply never been that thing, and that no confrontation in a December street was going to change it. The grief was there. So was something else. Something that was not quite free, but was moving in that direction. The particular forward momentum of a person who has stopped waiting for someone to tell them they're worth something. Vera Hutchins said, from where she was standing near the dry goods store, "Congratulations, Lydia." She said it simply, without theatrics, the way Vera did everything. Others followed. Earl, Old Man Dawson, a few others. Not effusive, just real. Franklin Ashcroft mounted his horse. Dale mounted his. They left the way they'd arrived in a way that was meant to look like choice, but had the quality of retreat, and everyone present was old enough to read the difference. Garrett stood beside Lydia in the pale December street and put his hand against the small of her back, just briefly, the lightest contact, there and then not. "Was that all right?" he said, low enough for just her. "I should have asked you first. I knew he'd be here and I thought—" "It was all right," she said. "I didn't want to push you into—" "Garrett." She turned to look at him. "It was all right." He looked at her for a moment. The tiredness in his eyes was still there. It wasn't going to go away in an afternoon, she knew that. It would take a long time to really leave. But behind it, something was steadier than it had been the first day she'd seen him come down off those porch steps. "Let's get the supplies," she said. "We need to be back before dark." He almost smiled again. Almost. She was beginning to collect those almost smiles the way Clara collected smooth stones. Not asking for more than she found, but keeping what was offered. They went into Dawson's store together, and the valley went back to its ordinary business around them. And outside, the December light sat clean and cold on the frozen road. And for once, for just this once, nothing that had happened felt like something she needed to survive. It felt, simply and without ceremony, like something she had won. The wedding was a quiet thing, which suited both of them. Judge Alderman came out from Cavalry Creek on a Thursday morning in the third week of December, a compact man with a gray beard and the unhurried manner of someone who had presided over enough frontier ceremonies to know that the legal part took 10 minutes and everything else took a lifetime. Vera Hutchins was there as witness, and Earl Pickett, and Old Man Dawson, who had apparently decided that witnessing the wedding of a woman whose family had tried to humiliate her was a reasonable use of a Thursday morning. Thomas stood in his good shirt with his collar done up wrong on one side, which Lydia fixed without comment before the judge started. Clara held a small bunch of dried flowers she'd put together herself from what remained in the kitchen herb bundles. Not roses, those would have to wait for spring, but something she'd made with her own hands and offered without being asked. It was not elaborate. Lydia wore her better dress, the dark blue one that was the nicest thing she owned, and Garrett wore a clean shirt and his least worn coat, and they stood in the front room of the Holloway house while Judge Alderman read the necessary words, and the winter light came through the window at a low angle that turned everything slightly gold. When it was done, Clara took Lydia's hand without preamble, just reached up and took it, small fingers wrapping around hers, and held on. That was the part Lydia remembered longest afterward. Not the words, or the papers, or the handshakes from Earl and Vera, just Clara's hand in hers, and the particular matter-of-fact quality of the gesture, as though the child had simply been waiting for the official permission to do something she'd already decided. They ate together after. Vera had brought a pie. Earl had brought a bottle of something that Garrett and the judge drank in small glasses, while Earl drank rather more of. And it was easy and imperfect in the way real things are, Thomas talking too much and knocking over his cup, and Clara eating 2 pieces of pie with the focused dedication of someone who has made a serious personal commitment to pie, and Judge Alderman telling a long story about another frontier wedding he'd performed that had involved a runaway horse and a collapsed fence, and Vera listening to all of it with her arms crossed and her sharp eyes warm in a way she didn't always let show. Garrett sat beside Lydia at the table, and their shoulders were close enough to touch without quite touching, And at one point his hand found hers under the table, just briefly, a press and release, there and not. And she thought that was enough. That all of this, exactly as it was enough. Just so. The trouble her father had seeded in the valley didn't die after the wedding announcement. Lydia hadn't expected it to. Franklin Ashcroft was not a man who accepted public defeats and moved on gracefully. He was a man who regrouped. What she hadn't anticipated was the specific form the regrouping took. It started with small things. A supplier in Millhaven who suddenly didn't have the particular grade of seed corn Garrett needed, though he'd stocked it reliably for 3 years. A neighboring rancher named Pettifer who backed out of a hay-sharing arrangement at the last minute without a real explanation, just a vague reference to changed circumstances. A rumor, which reached Lydia through Vera, who had appointed herself the Valley's intelligence service on Lydia's behalf, that Franklin had been telling people the Holloway Ranch's water access was legally questionable, that there was some issue with the original deed, that Garrett might be sitting on land with a clouded title. It was a lie. Lydia was certain of that before she even checked, because she knew her father's methods. He didn't need truth. He needed doubt. A question planted in the right ears grew faster than truth did, especially when the person planting it was established in the community, and the person being questioned was a widower who'd been struggling and distracted for 2 years and hadn't been tending his social fences as carefully as his actual ones. She told Garrett what she'd heard. They were in the barn. She'd found she often told him difficult things in the barn, where the work gave them both something to do with their hands, and the presence of the horses created a quality of patient attention that the house didn't always have. He listened without speaking, his hands continuing to work on the bridle he was mending, the leather going through his fingers in a steady rhythm. "The deed's clean," he said when she finished. "I've had it since my father built this place. There's no question about it. I know that. You know that." She met his eyes. "But if people start wondering, if buyers start hearing, there might be an issue." "The spring cattle sale," he said. "Yes." He set the bridle down, looked at the wall of the barn for a moment with the particular look he had when he was running numbers in his head that weren't adding up the way he needed them to. The spring cattle sale in Garrison Creek was 3 months away, and it was the single largest income event of the year for every rancher in the valley. If buyers came in already hearing whispers about clouded title on Holloway land, they might pull offers on principle, not because they believed it necessarily, but because uncertainty made men cautious. And cautious buyers made low offers or no offers at all. "What does he want?" Garrett said, and the question was directed at Lydia in the way he sometimes directed questions about her family at her, not accusatory, just using the most direct source available. She thought about her father, about the arithmetic of Franklin Ashcroft's resentments. "He wants it to hurt," she said. "He doesn't necessarily want a specific outcome. He wants you to feel the cost of keeping me. He wants me to feel responsible for that cost." Garrett looked at her. "Are you?" "No," she said. Then, more honestly, "I feel it. But that's different from being responsible for it." He nodded slowly. "All right." He picked the bridle up again. "We're not going to wait for him to do more damage. What do you want to do?" "I want to go talk to some people," he said, starting with Jim Alderman. He meant the judge. They'd stayed in contact after the wedding, and Alderman was a man of standing in Cavalry Creek whose word carried weight beyond his jurisdiction. "And I want you to talk to Vera." "Vera's already talking," Lydia said. "Good. Let her." What happened next was not a dramatic reckoning. It was slower and more practical than that, which was the way things actually worked in small frontier communities, where drama was quick and reputation was built over years. Lydia went to Vera, and Vera went to work with the energy of a woman who had been waiting for a reasonable cause. She talked to the women of the valley first, at the dry goods store, at the church social, at the informal gatherings that happened around quilting and food preservation that Lydia had started attending in December, and where she'd been slowly building the quiet credibility that came from showing up and being useful and not asking for anything in return. Vera talked to those women with the precision of a person making a case rather than spreading gossip, which was a distinction those women were old enough and sharp enough to recognize and respect. What emerged over the course of 3 weeks in January was something that surprised Lydia in its scope. It turned out that Franklin Ashcroft had left debts behind him in Millhaven County that people had simply not spoken about because debts were a private matter and he was an established man. A dispute with the Garrison Creek lumberyard over payment for materials he'd claimed were defective and refused to pay for. A handshake agreement with a rancher named Colton about shared grazing rights that Franklin had honored for 2 seasons and then stopped honoring, claiming the original terms had been verbal and therefore weren't binding. Small things, each of them. But they accumulated, and when Vera started asking careful questions, people started answering with the cautious relief of those who'd been sitting on something uncomfortable and were glad to finally set it down. Lydia rode out to the Colton place herself on a Wednesday in January. William Colton was a quiet man in his 60s, a widower like Garrett had been, who ran a modest operation by himself and kept his own counsel to a degree that bordered on hermitage. She'd met him once at the feed store, and he'd been civil but brief, the way very contained people are when they're not sure yet whether you're worth extending themselves for. She tied her horse at his fence and knocked, and he opened the door and looked at her with the neutral expression of a man reserving judgment. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Mr. Colton, I'd like to talk to you about my father, if you're willing." He let her in. She sat at his kitchen table, which was as spare and orderly as the man himself, and she told him what Franklin was doing, the whispers about the deed, the supplier arrangements being undermined, the systematic quiet campaign to make her husband pay for having defended her. She told it plainly, without editorializing, and when she finished, Colton sat with his coffee and looked out his window for a moment. "Your father told me the grazing agreement was never firm," Colton said, "that I'd misunderstood what was offered." "Did you misunderstand?" Colton looked at her directly. "No." "Would you be willing to say that to other people, to the Garrison Creek land office, if it came to that?" A long pause. Not reluctance, she thought, just the deliberate pace of a man who said things when he'd finished thinking them through. "Your husband's a good man," Colton said finally. "I've known his father's work on that land. There's no question about that deed, and Franklin Ashcroft knows it." He put his cup down. "Yes. I'll say what's true." She rode home through the cold with the January wind at her back, and she thought about how long her father had been able to operate on the assumption that no one would push back, that the people he dealt with dishonestly would stay quiet because confrontation was uncomfortable and he was an established man, and what was the point? The point, she thought, was that silence let him keep doing it, and she was done with the particular kind of silence that protected men like her father from their own behavior. Garrett went to Judge Alderman in Cavalry Creek and came back with something more useful than a legal opinion. He came back with Alderman's public statement, sent in a letter to the Millhaven County Land Recorder, confirming that the Holloway property deed had been reviewed and was unambiguous in both its origin and its current standing. Alderman put his name on it and his seal, and Garrett took copies to Dawson and to the feed suppliers and to the Garrison Creek Cattle Buyers Association, and he did it quietly and without announcement, the way a man addresses a practical problem rather than fighting a battle. The effect was not immediate. These things never were. But by the end of January, the whispers had stopped finding purchase in the way they had been, because people now had a piece of paper from a judge to put against whatever Franklin Ashcroft was saying, and a piece of paper from a judge tends to win that particular contest. What accelerated things was Pettifer. Hank Pettifer had backed out of the hay arrangement with Garrett in December, which they'd managed without. Barely, but without. He showed up at the Holloway Ranch on a Saturday in February, which Lydia later reflected was probably the most uncomfortable thing the man had done in recent memory, and asked to speak with Garrett. She let him in, made coffee, which she did by reflex for any visitor regardless of how she felt about them, and stood at the counter while the two men sat at the table. Pettifer was a big man, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that was currently doing the work of a man who has come to say something he doesn't find easy. "I heard what you did," he said to Garrett, "about the deed, getting Alderman to put it in writing." "It needed doing," Garrett said. "Your father-in-law came to me in December." Pettifer looked at the table. "Told me there were questions about your title, that it would reflect badly on any man who was seen to be doing business with you in the spring if things came out wrong." He paused. "I should have told you directly, rather than just backing off." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" "Because Franklin Ashcroft's been in this valley 20 years longer than I have, and I didn't want the trouble. Pettifer finally looked up. That was the wrong call. The silence in the kitchen had the specific texture of something being worked through. Lydia watched Garrett, watched him take the measure of what Pettifer was actually offering, which was not just an apology but a piece of the picture. Franklin had been specifically approaching people, naming names, making it about social cost. Who else did he talk to? Garrett said. Pettifer thought about it, named 3 names. One of them was the seed corn supplier, which confirmed what Lydia had suspected. The other 2 were buyers she didn't know, men from the Garrison Creek Cattle Network. Would you be willing to tell people what you just told me? Garrett said. Pettifer looked at him, then at Lydia, then back. I came here, didn't I? He said, which was his version of yes. After he left, Garrett sat at the kitchen table for a while without speaking. Lydia finished the bread she'd been working on and let him think, because sometimes a person needed to arrive somewhere at their own pace. He's been more organized about this than I thought, Garrett said finally. He planned it from the beginning, Lydia said. The confrontation here, then the scene in town, he expected that to work. And when it didn't, he already had the next approach ready. She shaped the bread dough on the board. My father doesn't waste anger, he banks it. How do you know him so well? I grew up watching him, she said simply. You learn people when you have no power over your circumstances. You study them because information is the only thing you can actually accumulate. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said, that you had to learn it that way. Don't be. She set the dough in the pan. It's useful now, hakachat. The campaign, she'd started thinking of it that way, which felt like a strong word but wasn't inaccurate, reached something like a conclusion in the 3rd week of February, though not through any single dramatic reversal. It happened in pieces. Colton talking to the men he knew, Pettifer making good on his commitment to say what was true. Vera moving through the women's networks with the systematic efficiency of a person who understood that community opinion was built in small rooms and quiet conversations rather than in public declarations. Earl Pickett, who knew everyone and talked to all of them, and who had a good memory for what was fact and what was fabrication, simply telling the accurate version of events to anyone who had questions. And Judge Alderman's letter, which sat in the county land office like a flat stone that nobody could move. What happened to Franklin Ashcroft's reputation was not a collapse. He'd built it over too many years for that. But it was a visible, permanent erosion. The lumberyard debt became known. The Colton grazing dispute became known. The business of him approaching people individually and asking them to distance themselves from Garrett became known, because Pettifer told it, and Pettifer was not the only one Franklin had approached. There were at least 2 others who, once Pettifer had broken cover, were willing to confirm the same pattern. The Valley didn't turn on Franklin the way it might have in a story that was tidier than real life. Some people would always take his side, or at least decline to take a position, which was its own kind of loyalty. The Breckett brothers remained in his orbit. Ruth Emery continued to maintain a careful silence that was the social equivalent of a shrug. These things didn't dissolve because the truth came out. They adjusted, recalibrated, found new justifications. But the majority shifted, and in a small frontier community, majority was what determined the practical reality of a person's daily existence. The spring cattle sale was in April, and when Garrett brought his stock to Garrison Creek, the buyers came. Lydia wasn't there for most of it. She'd stayed home with Clara, who had developed a winter cold that she was managing with the stoic misery of a child who doesn't want anyone to know she's miserable. But Thomas went with Garrett, and they came home 2 days later with Thomas so lit up with the importance of having been included in serious adult business that he could barely sit still at the supper table. Pa got good prices, he said. Better than last year. Mr. Garrett from the Cavalry Creek buyers said our stock was the best condition he'd seen from... Your father's name is also Mr. Holloway, Lydia said mildly. You might want to specify. Thomas blinked at this. Then he grinned in the way he'd been grinning more often lately. That loose, unguarded grin that had started appearing sometime in November and had been showing up with more regularity ever since. Pa got good prices, he amended. Better than expected. She looked at Garrett across the table. He had the look of a man who was tired from 2 days of cattle work and negotiation and coming back from something larger than just a sale. and who had not yet figured out how to hold all of that without letting it spill. "Good," she said. He looked back at her, and the tiredness was there, and so was the other thing, that steadiness behind the eyes that had been gaining ground on the tired for months now, the way light comes back in the spring, not all at once, but more each day until the balance has shifted, and you realize one morning that the dark is no longer winning. "Good," he agreed. Clara sneezed into her sleeve with the emphatic violence of a sick child who has been managing bravely and is starting to run low on bravery. Lydia got up and got the cloth she'd been using for Clara's face and brought it over, and Clara accepted it with the dignity of the genuinely miserable. "Mama used to make a thing," Clara said, her voice congested and thoughtful, "with honey and something else. When I was sick." "Honey and ginger, most likely," Lydia said. "I can make that." "Did your mama make it?" The question landed simply, without any particular weight behind it. Clara asked things directly, had always asked things directly. It was part of how she moved through the world. Lydia thought about her mother, who had died when Lydia was 8, who existed in her memory more as warmth than as detail. The thimble on the shelf, a voice, the particular smell of bread. "My mother made something similar," she said. "I don't know if it's exactly the same." "That's okay," Clara said. "I'll try yours." It was such a small thing to say, but Lydia felt it settle somewhere in her chest with the specific weight of something real, not a replacement, not a pretending, just an acceptance of what was here and what was offered. "I'll try yours." 4 words from a 7-year-old with a winter cold, and they mattered more than most things she'd been told. She made the honey and ginger. Clara drank it with careful consideration, the way she approached most things, and then said it was different from her mama's, but not bad, which Lydia took as the honest endorsement it was. In late February, she went back to the Ashcroft homestead, not to reconcile, not to fight. She'd thought about it for a long time and decided that she needed to go, and that the reason was not her father, but herself, that there were things she'd left behind in that house that were hers and that she wanted, and that waiting for the right moment or the right feeling meant waiting forever, so she might as well go. She rode alone. She'd told Garrett where she was going, and he'd looked at her with that quality of attention that meant he was assessing whether to offer to come, and she'd told him, "No, thank you." This was something she needed to do without reinforcement, and he'd understood that immediately, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on. She tied her horse at the gate. The property looked the same as it always had, smaller than she remembered it feeling. The way places from your past often do when you've been living in a larger version of yourself. The dog was there, still tied to the fence post, and he looked at her with the familiar disinterest of a dog who has made his peace with human comings and goings. Her father was on the porch. He saw her ride in, and he stood up from the chair and watched her come through the gate without moving toward her or away. She climbed the porch steps. They stood facing each other with the particular specific quality of 2 people who know everything about each other's worst moments. "Lydia," he said. "I came to get my mother's things," she said. "There are a few items in the house, her sewing basket, the small portrait in the hall." He looked at her for a moment. "You could have written." "I could have," she agreed. A pause. Roy appeared in the doorway behind their father and then disappeared again, which told her he'd seen her and decided the porch was Franklin's territory. "The things you've been saying about Garrett's land," she said, "you know they're not true." Franklin's expression was the one she'd always thought of as his official face, the composed, dignified arrangement that meant he was managing a presentation. There were questions that needed asking. "There were no questions. You invented them." She held his gaze. "You know it, and I know it, and now most of the valley knows it. I'm not saying this to fight you. I'm saying it because—" She stopped, tried to find the true version of what she wanted to say, which was harder than the angry version. "Because I'd like you to stop. Not for me. I can manage what you do to me. But Garrett has 2 children and a ranch and a life, and they don't deserve to carry the cost of you being angry that your plan didn't work." Franklin looked at her for a long moment. And the look was, she wasn't sure. Something more complicated than she'd expected to find. Not remorse exactly, not in a man like Franklin Ashcroft, but something that might have been the distant cousin of it, glimpsed briefly before the official face reasserted itself. You've done well enough for yourself, it seems, he said finally. It was not an apology. It was the closest he had. Better than you thought I would, she said, which was the closest she had to an answer. She went inside and collected what was hers, the sewing basket from the shelf in the back room, her mother's thimbles companion piece she hadn't known was still there, the small portrait from the hall that showed a woman she barely remembered who had her own quiet eyes. She carried them out to her horse and tied them in the saddlebag and mounted up. Her father was still on the porch. She looked at him from the saddle. This man who had been the whole of her world for 23 years, who had told her in ways large and small that she was less than she was, who had sent her away like something disposable and been wrong about what would happen next. She looked at him, and she felt the grief she'd been feeling all along, the grief for what a father could have been and wasn't. And underneath that, at last, a kind of done. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, in the traditional sense, but done in the way of a woman who has finished carrying a weight that was never hers to carry and has set it down in a place she does not intend to return to. "Goodbye, Papa," she said, same as she'd said it in the yard in December. Franklin Ashcroft raised one hand. Not a wave, exactly. More the gesture of a man acknowledging that something has concluded, even if he would never say so in words. She turned her horse and rode home. The road was the same road Earl Pickett had driven her down in October, in the opposite direction, with a flour sack in her lap and nothing settled. She rode it now in the pale February light, with her mother's things in her saddlebag and her own horse under her. Garrett had given her the use of the mare, Cedar, whom she'd calmed in the storm, and who trusted her now with the uncomplicated trust of an animal whose memory of fear includes the person who stayed, and the homestead ahead of her was the one with the fixed fence and the rehung barn door and the garden beds turned and waiting for spring. She didn't ride fast. The cold was clean and the sky was the particular deep blue it got in February when the moisture had dropped out of it, and the hills on either side of the road were familiar now in the specific way that places become familiar when you've been watching them through seasons rather than just passing through. When the Holloway place came into view, Clara was in the yard, recovered from her cold apparently, or recovered enough to be outside, and she looked up when she heard the horse and watched Lydia come down the road with the 7-year-old's direct attention. "You're back," Clara said. "I'm back," Lydia said. She dismounted and led Cedar to the barn, and Clara came alongside her the way she'd taken to doing, not asking for anything particularly, just present, just there, the same way she'd taken Lydia's hand on the day of the wedding without announcement. "Did you get what you needed?" Clara said. Lydia thought about the sewing basket and the portrait and the long look from her father that had been as close to an ending as she was going to get. "Yes," she said. Clara nodded, satisfied with this, and held the barn door while Lydia led Cedar inside. The ranch was quiet around them. The horses moved in their stalls. Outside, the February light was already starting its early retreat toward the hills, the sky going that pre-sunset amber at the edges. Somewhere in the house, Thomas was doing something that involved enough noise to suggest it was something he probably shouldn't be doing. Lydia unsaddled Cedar with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this particular task long enough that her hands were ahead of her thoughts, and she thought about spring, about the garden beds and the roses Clara wanted along the south fence, and the way the property had looked in October through Earl Pickett's wagon, and the way it looked now, and the distance between those two things was not a miracle or a transformation in the grand sense. It was just work. Just one day after another of showing up and doing what needed doing and staying when staying was the right thing, even when it was hard, even when the cost was higher than she'd anticipated. It was enough. It had always been enough. She just hadn't been in the right place for it to count before. Spring came to the Holloway Ranch the way spring always comes to high country, argumentatively, in fits and starts, with cold snapping back just when you'd committed to believing the warmth was real. The roses went in on a Saturday in late March, when the ground had finally thawed enough to work properly. Clara had been asking about them since February, not urgently, not with the pestering quality that some children brought to wanting things, but with a steady, patient reminder that suggested she understood the timing had to be right, and was willing to wait as long as the waiting was purposeful. Lydia had ordered the canes through Dawson's store in January, specifying a hardy climbing variety that could handle the valley winters, and they'd arrived in early March wrapped in burlap and looking, frankly, like sticks that had no intention of ever becoming anything. "Those are the roses," Thomas said, when she unwrapped them on the kitchen table. "Those are the roses." He picked one up and examined it with the skepticism of a 10-year-old confronting something that didn't look like what it was supposed to be. "They look dead." "They're dormant," Lydia said. "There's a difference." "How do you know?" "Because dead things don't have these." She showed him the small, tight buds along the cane, barely visible, the compressed green of a thing holding itself in reserve until the conditions were worth opening for. He looked at them with a new and more respectful attention. On the Saturday they planted, Garrett came out to help without being asked. Not because the job required him, it was manageable, but because he'd started doing that, appearing in proximity to things she was doing with the unassuming quality of a man who simply wanted to be nearby. He didn't make a production of it, and she didn't comment on it. It had become one of the quiet agreements they'd accumulated over the months, a language of presence that didn't need translation. Clara directed the placement with seriousness that the situation deserved, standing at the south fence and studying the line of the wall with her head tilted. "A little more to the left," she said. Garrett moved the first cane left. "More." He moved it again. "That's it." Clara looked at the spot, then at Lydia. "Mamas were right about there, I think." "Then that's right," Lydia said. They planted 6 canes along the fence in the pale March afternoon, tamping the soil firm around each one, and Clara watched every step with the gravity of a child preserving something she couldn't have put into words but understood completely. When the last one was in, she stood back and looked at the row of bare sticks against the weathered fence boards, and her expression was the complicated one she sometimes got, the one that held grief and something forward-moving in the same space, the way children who have lost something carry it without being crushed by it because they have no choice, and because resilience in the young is a fiercer thing than adults generally credit. "They'll bloom by June," Lydia said. "How do you know?" "Because I'll make sure of it," Lydia said, which was not a scientific answer but was the true one. Clara considered this. Then she nodded, satisfied, and went inside to wash her hands. Garrett stood beside Lydia at the fence, and they both looked at the planted row. His shoulder was warm against hers in the cold afternoon. Neither of them said anything for a while, which was fine. They'd gotten good at the silences that didn't need filling. "She talked about Martha this morning," he said eventually. "More than she usually does." "I know, she told me too." He looked at her. "What did she say?" "That her mama would have liked me." Lydia kept her eyes on the fence. She said it very carefully, like she wasn't sure if it was okay to say. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I thought so too." She paused. "I told her that loving her mama and having room for me weren't in competition with each other, that she didn't have to choose what to do with it." Garrett was quiet. She heard him let out a breath that had some weight behind it. "That was the right thing," he said. "I don't always know the right thing," she said. "With her, with Thomas. I'm making most of it up as I go." "So am I," he said. "I've been making it up since the day they were born." She almost laughed, which she did more often now than she had in the previous 23 years combined, and that fact alone told her something about the nature of the life she'd been living before, and the nature of this one. What? April came, and with it the spring cattle sale, and the results told a cleaner story than anyone who'd heard Franklin Ashcroft's whispers in December could have predicted. Garrett had spent the winter doing what Lydia had watched him do from the beginning, methodically, without drama, addressing each problem in front of him. The hay situation from the fall had been resolved before the hard cold arrived. The barn repairs were complete. The horse stock was in the best condition it had been in 3 years, which she knew because Thomas told her what Garrett said, and Garrett didn't exaggerate about things like that. The cattle sale in Garrison Creek ran over 2 days, and on the second day a buyer from a large operation in the eastern part of the territory walked the Holloway stock with the particular thoroughness of a man who had been recommended something and was verifying whether the recommendation was accurate. Vera Hutchins' husband, it turned out, had a long-standing connection to this buyer. Frank Hutchins was not a man Lydia had seen much of, quieter than his wife in the way that some husbands of very direct women manage to exist. But it turned out he had his own uses, and one of them was knowing the right people in the Eastern cattle networks. Garrett came home from the sale on a Thursday evening and came into the kitchen where she was finishing supper and put a figure on the table, written on the back of a receipt from the Garrison Creek stock office, and waited. She picked it up, looked at it, set it back down. "That's nearly double last year," she said. "It is." "The Eastern buyer?" "Took a third of the stock at top price." He sat down. He looked tired in this way of someone who has been holding tension for a long time and has just set it down, and his body is catching up to the relief. "He wants first consideration next spring. Said he'd send word to 2 other operations he works with." She sat across from him. The number on that receipt was not a fortune. This was a frontier ranch, not a dynasty, and there were debts still, and a dry summer could undo a good spring, and nothing about this land or this life came with guarantees. But it was enough. More than enough for this year, and it pointed toward something that could be built on. "Vera's husband," she said. "I'll have to thank him." Garrett looked at her across the table. "And Vera. Vera doesn't want thanks. She wants to be right." He did smile then, a full one, not the almost variety, the real kind that moved all the way up to his eyes and changed his whole face for a moment. She'd seen it before, that smile, but not often enough to stop noticing it when it appeared. "She usually is," he said. Thomas's footsteps came thundering down from upstairs, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who has been listening to adult conversation from the hall and has decided the information is important enough to risk admitting it. "Did we do good at the sale?" "We did fine," Garrett said. "Fine or good?" "Good," Garrett said, and Thomas made a sound of pure satisfaction and disappeared back up the stairs, and somewhere above them they heard the thump of him apparently throwing himself onto his bed in celebration, which was Thomas's version of restraint. The Breckett brothers came by in May, which surprised her. Not together. Frank came alone on a Tuesday afternoon when Garrett was out at the far pasture, which she later suspected was deliberate timing. He came to the door with his hat in his hands, which was not a posture she'd seen from him before, and he asked if she had a moment. She let him in. Made coffee. Sat across from him at the kitchen table that had become the place where hard conversations happened in this household, and waited. Frank Breckett was not a man built for the kind of conversation he was apparently attempting. He was a man built for range work and blunt talk, and the kind of frontier sociability that didn't require much interior examination. He sat with his coffee and struggled with something for long enough that she considered helping him, then decided he needed to get there himself. "We said some things," he said finally, "last fall, when we came by." "I heard some of them," she said. He looked at the table. "Your father's he presents a convincing version of himself," he said. "When he was going around in December talking about Holloway's deed, it seemed like something that should be taken seriously. And now? And now it seems like a man who is embarrassed that his scheme didn't work." Frank looked up at her. "We repeated things we shouldn't have. Things that we didn't know to be true." She held his gaze. "Did it cause Garrett problems? With buyers?" "Some. Yes, some of the men we talked to passed it on." He looked uncomfortable in the physical way of a large man in a small chair. "Alderman's letter fixed most of it, but we helped start something we shouldn't have." Lydia thought about what she wanted to say to this man who had looked at her with that private exchange of amusement the first day he'd come, who had said things to his brother about what he wouldn't have picked, who had carried her father's water without examining what he was carrying. She thought about anger, which was present but not useful here. She thought about what actually served the life she was building. "Garrett will have opinions of his own," she said, "about what this costs and what it doesn't. That's between you and him." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "But I'll tell you what I think costs a man more than a bad season, and that's a community that's learned not to trust him. What you and your brother did added to a story about Garrett that wasn't true. That's what needs repairing." Frank was quiet. "How?" "Tell the true version," she said. "The way you just told it to me. Tell it to the people you told the false version to." She looked at him steadily. "That's all. It's not complicated, it's just uncomfortable." He nodded slowly. Not eagerly. This was not a man who did eager, but with the settled quality of someone who has arrived at a decision and is committing to it. "All right," he said. He finished his coffee and left, and she stood at the window and watched him ride out, and thought about how many times in her life she'd watched men take up more space than their understanding warranted, and how rarely they came back to account for it. Frank Beckett was not a changed man. He was a man who had done something wrong and was trying to correct it, which was a different and more realistic thing, and she could work with that. Summer arrived in its full weight, the valley baking under July skies, and the Holloway Ranch moved through its season with the reliable rhythm of a place that had found its footing again. The garden was better than adequate. She'd used that word in the fall, adequate, when Clara asked about the garden at her old home, and she'd meant it as a practical assessment. The Holloway garden in its first real summer under her attention was something different, not extravagant, not a showpiece. This was working land and everything in it pulled its weight, but abundant in the way that happens when you combine decent soil with proper planning and someone who actually cares about the outcome. Beans and squash and corn in the main beds, the kitchen herbs in their own section where she could reach them without crossing the whole garden, the tomatoes staked properly against the summer winds. The roses bloomed in June as promised. Clara found her at the south fence on the morning they opened, the first blush pink flowers unfurling from buds she'd been monitoring for 2 weeks, and stood beside her in silence for a moment that had its own particular quality. "They're the same color," Clara said. "Are they?" "I think so." She studied the flowers with the precision she applied to everything. "I was little when mamas were growing, but I think they're the same." "Good," Lydia said. Clara reached out and touched one of the petals, very lightly, the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to touch, and then dropped her hand and looked at Lydia with those dark eyes that saw everything. "I'm glad you stayed," she said, simply, the way Clara said things. Lydia looked at this child who had lost her mother and had watched her father grieve and had sat in the kitchen in the early mornings learning how to make biscuits a new way, who had left a drawing on a pillow without a note, and had taken a hand at a wedding without waiting to be asked, and had directed rose planting with the authority of a person who knew exactly what she was preserving. "Me too," Lydia said, which was the truest thing she knew. "Ma, there is something that happens to a person when they've spent years being told they don't count, and it is this. They develop an interior life that is extraordinarily self-sufficient. They stop waiting for permission to feel things, because permission has never been reliable. They stop needing confirmation from outside themselves, because outside confirmation has been inconsistent at best and cruel at worst. They build, quietly and without audience, a version of themselves that operates on internal resources, stubborn, sometimes lonely, but fundamentally harder to break than people assume. Lydia Ashcroft, Lydia Holloway now, though the name still occasionally surprised her when she heard it, understood this about herself in the way that people understand things they've never put into words but have always known. She had built herself in the absence of anyone who cared to do it with her. That was not a triumphant thing, not something to celebrate. It was a survival thing, the kind of adaptation that happens because the alternative is worse. But it meant that when the right conditions finally arrived, she already had the material. She didn't need to be made into someone. She just needed somewhere worth being. She thought about this sometimes in the ordinary moments that are the actual texture of a life. In the kitchen, in the early mornings, in the garden, in the long summer evenings, in the barn with Cedar's warm weight against her shoulder. She thought about what it meant that the family who'd thrown her away had, in doing so, delivered her to the only place where what she was turned out to be exactly what was needed. She didn't think her father had done her a favor. She was clear on that. There was no version of the story in which what he'd done was acceptable, or kind, or anything other than what it was. A man treating his daughter as disposable and being wrong about what she was worth. The fact that it led somewhere good didn't redeem it. She'd given up the habit of redeeming things that didn't deserve it. It was a habit that costs women in particular a great deal, the constant, generous reinterpretation of harm. She'd been doing it her whole life, and she was done. What she'd come to instead was simpler and harder to explain. That she was here, and this was real, and the people who had mattered to her now were people who had chosen her back. Garrett found her at the fence on a late July evening, the day after Thomas's 10th birthday, which they'd celebrated with a cake Clara had insisted on making herself, and which had been only partially successful in structural terms, but entirely successful in the ways that mattered. The evening was warm, and the sky to the west was going through its summer performance, the slow burn of orange and rose above the ridgeline, the kind of sky that makes even unsentimental people stop and look. She was leaning on the fence watching it. He came and leaned beside her, and they watched it together the way they'd been watching things together for 9 months now, with the comfort of people who have earned their proximity to each other through accumulated ordinary days. "Pettifer asked me something today," Garrett said. "What?" "He's having trouble with his south fence line, same issue we had last fall. He asked if I thought you might have time to come look at it. Said you seem to have figured out the drainage problem we had faster than he expected." She considered this. "He asked for me specifically?" "He did." She looked at the evening sky. Hank Pettifer, who had backed out of the hay arrangement in December because Franklin Ashcroft had made it socially costly, had spent the spring making good on his commitment to say the true version of things, and had apparently arrived somewhere in the vicinity of respect. She could work with that. "I'll go next week," she said. Garrett nodded. They were quiet for a while. A nighthawk cut across the darkening sky above the pasture, its particular erratic flight the signature of something hunting by instinct. "Vera told me something at the supply store yesterday," he said. "Vera tells everyone something at the supply store. She told me—" He paused, and something in the pause had a quality she recognized as something he'd been thinking about for a while. "She said that people talk about this place differently now than they did. She said the Holloway Ranch used to be talked about as a place that was going under, and now it's talked about as— She said people call it solid. Solid." She turned the word over. "That's Vera's highest compliment," she said. "I know." He looked at her, the evening light doing what evening light does to a person's face when you know them well enough to read it, the way it smoothed some things and made others more visible. "It's not just the land, you know that. Garrett, I'm not saying something romantic," he said, with the slight self-conscious quality he had when he was navigating the space between feeling something and saying it. "I'm saying something true. The land was always good land. The cattle were always good stock. What was missing was—" He looked for the word with the deliberate care he brought to finding the right one. "Was someone paying attention, someone who cared enough about all of it to actually look at it." She was quiet. The sky was deepening from rose to something darker at the edges. "I paid attention to things my whole life because it was how I stayed ahead of trouble," she said. "It wasn't— I'm not going to claim it was virtue." "It doesn't have to be virtue to matter," he said. "It just has to work." She looked at him. He was watching the sky, his profile familiar to her now in the way that things become familiar when you've seen them through seasons. The jaw with its 2-day stubble, the set of his shoulders when he was at ease rather than braced for something, the way his left hand rested on the fence rail with the fingers slightly curled, an old habit she'd never asked about. "I don't look at myself the way they used to talk about me," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it then. The evening, maybe. The particular quality of late July light that made things feel speakable. "I used to, for a long time. I'd hear what they said and I'd check it against myself like it might be accurate. My father, my brothers, the people in town who had their opinions." She paused. "I don't do that anymore." Garrett turned to look at her. "When did you stop?" She thought about it honestly. "Somewhere around November," she said. "Maybe earlier. I'm not sure there was a single moment. It was more like, one day I noticed I wasn't doing it, and I thought about when I'd stopped, and I couldn't find a specific day." He held her gaze in the way he did sometimes that felt like the opposite of performance, just looking, just seeing. "Good," he said. It came out quiet and certain, the same way he'd said all right that first night at the kitchen table, the same weight of a man who doesn't use words to decorate but to say the thing precisely. The sky had gone to deep purple at the horizon, the last light retreating west. Behind them, from the house, they could hear the particular quality of sounds that meant the end of a day. Thomas's footsteps. Clara's voice saying something. The ordinary domestic music of people closing up a house for the night. "I should go in," Lydia said. "Yeah," Garrett said. Neither of them moved immediately. It was Garrett who reached over and found her hand on the fence rail, not the brief press and release of the kitchen table, not the practical handhold of helping her down from a wagon, but a real hold, the kind that isn't going anywhere, fingers laced through hers with the ease of a thing that has been building toward itself for months and has finally arrived. She let him hold on, let herself hold back. They stood at the fence until the last of the light was gone and the first stars were starting, which was longer than practical and exactly as long as it needed to be. The woman the Ashcroft family had sent away came back to the valley the following spring, not as the subject of gossip or sympathy, but as herself. Which is to say, as the woman who had fixed the water trough and replanted the roses and stood in a December street without flinching, who knew how to calm a horse in a storm and how to talk to a grieving child about biscuits, and whose voice, when she offered an opinion about drainage or hay storage or the right time to plant, was listened to in the way that people listen when experience has made itself evident. She was not celebrated. She did not require it. What she had built was not a reputation, but a reality, and those are different things. A reputation is what other people decide about you, and a reality is what you actually are. And she had always understood that the second one is the only one that holds. The ranch that had been a struggling operation in October became, over 2 years, one of the more consistently productive in Millhaven County. Not the largest, they didn't have the acreage for that, and Garrett had no interest in expansion for its own sake, but reliable, well-run, the kind of place that Eastern cattle buyers sent recommendations about, and that neighboring ranchers came to when they had a problem they hadn't solved before, because the woman at the Holloway place had usually encountered a version of it and had a practical thought on the matter. Thomas turned 11 in July and was tall enough that he'd started having opinions about being treated like a child, which Lydia handled the same way she'd handled the hay tarp, showed him the right way, let him practice it, corrected the corners without making a production of it. He was a good worker when he remembered to be, and he was becoming, slowly and with the fits and starts of young men everywhere, someone she could see plainly. His father's steadiness coming up through him under all the noise of being almost 12, the thing that would define him eventually starting to show its shape. Clara planted a second row of roses in the spring of the second year, along the east fence this time. Her own expansion of something that had started as memory and was becoming something else. Not a replacement, but an addition, which is the honest way that living people honor the dead. The roses bloomed pink and loose and ordinary and beautiful in June, the same as the first row, and Clara cut a few stems and put them in a jar on the kitchen table where they stayed until the petals fell. And then she put them in the compost because Clara was 7 going on 40 and understood that things returned to the ground, and that was fine. Lydia found the jar of composted petals in the garden one morning and worked them into the soil near the rose beds without ceremony, which felt like the right thing. What she understood, in the accumulated evidence of 2 years of a life she had not planned and had not been given, but had built with her own 2 dirty, capable hands, was this: that the people who dismiss you are not in possession of facts. They are in possession of their own limitations, and they mistake those limitations for assessments of you. Her father had looked at a quiet daughter with no appetite for performance and seen something plain and unremarkable. What he had actually been looking at was someone whose resources were entirely interior, whose stubbornness and attention and refusal to break under pressure were just invisible to people who only counted what showed. The frontier did not care about what showed. It cared about what held. And Lydia Holloway, in all the unbeautiful particular reality of who she was, stubborn and imperfect, and sometimes still wary in the leftover way of people who have been dismissed for long enough that trust doesn't come automatic, held. She held through hard winters and dry summers and the ongoing daily negotiation of 2 children growing into themselves and a marriage that was not easy because nothing real was easy, that required constant tending the way a garden did, that had seasons of its own. She and Garrett did not always agree. There were arguments, practical ones about the ranch, harder ones about the children, occasionally ones about old wounds that surfaced without warning the way old wounds do, his grief still present under the steadiness, her wariness still present under the belonging, both of them sometimes losing the thread of the other and having to find it again. That was the actual shape of it. Not a transformation, not a rescue, his or hers. A building, slow, cooperative, with all the flaws that building involves when the materials are two imperfect people, and a piece of ground that demanded more than either of them could give some seasons. But they showed up for it, both of them. That was the thing. On the last morning of the second summer, Lydia stood at the south fence in the early light before the household woke and looked at the 2 rows of roses and the garden beyond them and the barn where Cedar moved in her stall and the house where 3 people she loved were still sleeping in the easy way that the safely housed sleep. The sky was doing its August thing, vast and pale blue and already carrying the first hint of the season turning at its edges, that almost invisible suggestion of gold in the morning light that meant summer was aware of its own ending. She was 33 years old. She had arrived here with everything she owned in a flour sack. She had been sent here as a joke and had stayed as herself, which was the only version of staying that had ever mattered. She did not think about her father often now, but she thought about him then, about a man who had looked at his daughter and seen nothing worth keeping. She thought about what it cost him, that blindness. Not in the way of wanting him to suffer for it. She was past that, not because she'd forgiven it in the tidy sense, but because she was no longer organized around it. She thought about the specific waste of it, the years of usefulness he had taken from her and not recognized as such. The person she had been right in front of him the whole time. She hoped he was all right. She did, actually, not with warmth, but with the distant neutral wish of someone who has moved far enough away from a thing that they can afford to be decent about it. The kitchen door opened behind her. She heard the particular cadence of Clara's footsteps, lighter than Thomas's, more deliberate, and then the girl was beside her at the fence in her nightgown with her dark hair uncombed and her feet in boots she'd put on without stockings, which was a decision Lydia filed away to address after coffee. Clara looked at the roses in the early light, then at Lydia. "You're up early," she said. "Same time as always," Lydia said. Clara leaned on the fence beside her. They looked at the garden and the barn and the pale summer sky together for a while. And the morning was quiet around them in the way that mornings are quiet before a household wakes, full of potential, slightly held, waiting to become what the day made it. "I had a dream about Mama last night," Clara said, without particular distress. She'd started doing that, mentioning Martha in the casual way of someone integrating a loss rather than guarding it. She was in the garden. What was she doing? Just standing there, looking at the roses. Clara considered this. I think she was happy about them. Lydia looked at the roses in the morning light, the first few late summer blooms still open, holding on past their season the way stubborn things do. "I think so too," she said. Clara straightened up from the fence with the decisive movement of a 9-year-old who has completed a contemplative moment and is ready to move on to breakfast. "I'm going to make the biscuits today," she said, "the way we figured out." "The way with the sugar?" "Yes." "All right," Lydia said. "I'll be in shortly." Clara went inside, her boots loud on the porch steps. Lydia stayed at the fence another minute in the quiet, her hands on the top rail, her face to the morning, the ranch spreading out around her in all its imperfect working reality. The fences that needed checking, the garden that needed its last summer harvest, the horses that needed exercise, the accounts that Garrett would go over tonight at the kitchen table while she did the mending, and Thomas pretended to do his reading, and Clara actually did hers. All of it ordinary. All of it hers. She pushed off the fence and went inside to help with the biscuits, and the morning opened up ahead of them. And that was enough. That had always been enough. She just needed somewhere worth spending it,